Contemporary tribal nations and the state of Washington. How sovereign tribes are sustained and protected in the Pacific Northwest. Take a look at this map. It shows where Washington's 29 federally recognized tribes are located throughout the state. Sovereignty. Sovereignty is a community's independent, rightful power and authority to govern itself. Although the tribes of Washington state signed treaties in the 1850s that were supposed to provide freedom and protection, including sovereignty to practice their traditional ways of life, most Native Americans were forced to live on reservations where the treaties were all but forgotten. In the mid-1960s, almost over 100 years later, tribes across the nation, inspired by the civil rights movement, began campaigning for restoration of their political and cultural rights. Tribal councils and independent groups like the American Indian Movement pressured corrupt tribal representatives and the government itself to regain the needs of the tribes. In 1969, Washington State established the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs to function as an advisory council to the governor. The establishment of this office officially recognized the sovereignty of the tribes in Washington and set up a government-to-government relationship between the state and the tribes. The 29 federally recognized tribal nations of Washington entered into a Centennial Accord with the state on August 4, 1989. The Centennial Accord provides a framework for government-to-government cooperation, sets up systems to ensure communication is open and accessible, recognizes the sovereignty of both governments, the state and the tribe, values the culture and history of each tribe represented, and calls for a yearly report of how state and tribes work together for mutual benefit. Every year, the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs publishes that report on how the state and tribes worked together. Some of the highlights from the 2012 report are included below. Washington Department of Agriculture helped the Yakima Nation and the Swinomish tribe deal with pest control problems threatening their crops. A food safety program helped Native-owned food processing businesses to inspect and ensure food safety. Department of Archaeology worked with tribes to identify and protect Native burial grounds. Department of Commerce worked with tribes to establish internet access on the reservations. Tribal police worked with state police to identify and capture several criminal gangs and drug trafficking organizations. And tribal members participated in establishing early learning guidelines for the state's education standards. These are all ways the state and the tribes work together. Here are some other modern issues for tribes in Washington state. Tribal casinos. Gaming was always a big part of tribal culture, and in the 1970s, some tribes instituted gaming to earn profit for the reservation. These were mostly bingo halls. Several states had laws restricting bingo and other gaming, and the tribes tried to exert their sovereignty by continuing the gaming within their own territories. A lawsuit appealed in the Supreme Court in the 1970s found that states could neither collect property tax from reservation residents, nor could they regulate the activities of the tribe on federally recognized tribal land. In 1988, after several lawsuits, the U.S. government established the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. The National Indian Gaming Commission notes there are now 460 tribal gaming establishments in the U.S. Tribal casinos in the West generate about $4.8 billion in revenue per year. However, most of that revenue comes from only about 12% of the casinos. Most casinos are not as profitable. Here are some positives of casino establishment. Tribes have been able to build more infrastructure, including roads, buildings, and schools on their reservations. Tribes have been able to expand social services to their members, including legal aid, job assistance, and other services. And casinos provide jobs for tribal members and have allowed many reservations to upgrade living conditions for reservation residents. But some drawbacks of casino establishment also exist. Not all tribes have successful gaming operations, usually because of their locations. So there is much inequality among reservations, and poverty remains high in many tribal areas. Also, the U.S. Indian Gaming Commission has allowed for much more federal intervention in tribal affairs, including strict regulations and law enforcement, which can sometimes cause conflict with tribal sovereignty. Macaw whaling. The coastal Macaw tribe has centuries-old tradition of hunting whales, which they consider sacred. They use the whales in several ways that provide for the tribe. In the Macaw Treaty of 1855, the government took thousands of acres of land from the tribe. In exchange, the government committed to protecting the tribe's whaling traditions. However, because the commercial whaling industry around the world almost caused the extinction of whales, the tribe was forced to postpone its tradition in the 1920s. Then, in 1999, the tribe was allowed to conduct its first successful whale hunt after more than 70 years. The ritual is an enormous spiritual, physical, and mental exercise for tribal members. Whales are considered sacred, and every part of it is honored and used in reverence by the tribe. The traditional method of whaling involves harpooning, so the tribe adjusted to a more modern and humane way of killing the whales instantly so they don't suffer. Despite these precautions and the spiritual nature of the hunt, several environmentalist groups protested the first modern whale hunt in 1999, and they continue to do so. The conflict sometimes results in tribal members guarding the entrances to the reservation to prevent environmental activists from entering. Several clashes have occurred between the groups. The successful whale hunt in 1999 was culturally significant for the Macaw tribe. The tribal chairman reported in 2001 that hundreds of young people had been inspired by the renewal of the tribe's whale culture to learn their native language and customs. The young people also assembled the bones of the whale for display in the cultural center. In 2001, a federal court put the hunt on hold to consider its environmental aspects. Environmentalists and anti-whaling groups lauded the decision. In 2002, a federal appeals court kept the hunt on hold indefinitely. The tribe has appealed the decision and still awaits approval to again continue with its whaling tradition. Endangered salmon. As you've learned, the salmon is one of the most sacred animals in the Pacific Northwest tribal cultures. As Washington's population grew, several things contributed to the deterioration of the natural habitat of salmon. Development, logging, overfishing, dam construction on the Columbia, pollution, and average temperature increases. Since 1991, 17 species of salmon have been listed as endangered or threatened. By 1999, 40% of salmon had been depleted from their historical breeding grounds throughout the Pacific Northwest. For more than 10 years, tribes have cooperated with Washington state government and residents to restore the salmon to their natural habitat and numbers. Today, tribes are working with the state to restore the river and coastal ecosystems to try to restore the salmon habitats. 24 tribes entered agreements with the state to define fishing seasons and areas. Puget Sound tribes worked with the state to reestablish habitats of other coastal species important to the ecosystem, including Dungeness crab, shrimp, clams, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and oysters. Barriers to fish spawning and breeding have been broken down to provide more passage along the rivers. Despite the advancements and work to ensure tribal sovereignty and progress, there are still many challenges that stem from the legacy of the treatment of Native Americans and the reservation policies. Tribes must still work to restore and preserve their languages and cultures. How they interact with the government and people of the Pacific Northwest will continue to impact those efforts. One huge challenge remains the very high poverty rates on reservations, as you can see from this graph.